The replacement happened quietly. Too quietly. That was the genius of it. The set was already alive when Anthony Hopkins arrived. Voices overlapping. Assistants moving with purpose. The low hum of a production that had found its rhythm. This wasn't the kind of day that invited chaos. It was a table read day. Structured. Predictable. Reverent. Everyone had their scripts. Everyone except Anthony Hopkins. Or rather, he thought he did. A co-star had been watching him for weeks, noting the habits. Hopkins always arrived early. He always placed his script on the same corner of the table. He always read without previewing, trusting the text, trusting the room. Trust was the opening. During a break the previous afternoon, while Hopkins was in discussion with the director, the co-star had moved. No flourish. No nervous glances. Just a smooth exchange. Real script out, fake script in. The fake was immaculate. Same font. Same paperweight. Same dog-eared corner where Hopkins liked to mark his place. The only difference was the content. And that difference wouldn't reveal itself until Hopkins read it aloud. The co-star had almost backed out. Almost. Don't. One of the assistants had whispered. He'll kill you. No. The co-star had replied quietly. He'll appreciate it. Morning came. Hopkins entered the room with his usual calm gravity. He greeted the director, nodded to the cast, and took his seat. He placed the script down, aligned it carefully, and folded his hands. No suspicion. The director cleared his throat. All right, let's begin. Anthony, you're up. Hopkins nodded once and opened the script. The co-star held their breath. Hopkins read the first line. Perfectly normal. The second line. Still normal. The third. A flicker. Barely perceptible, but it was there. The co-star noticed. The assistant noticed. A grip across the room noticed and leaned forward slightly. Hopkins paused. Just long enough to recalibrate. He continued. The line was off. Not outrageous. Not obviously wrong. Just strange. The phrasing felt slightly exaggerated. The rhythm leaned too hard into melodrama. It was as if the character had been nudged half an inch off center. Hopkins adjusted instinctively, grounding the words, smoothing the edges. That's when it happened. He reached the paragraph. The paragraph that did not exist. Hopkins read it anyway. Because that's what he did. He committed. The room stiffened. The lines escalated. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. The character began making oddly specific observations. Then overly poetic declarations. Then statements that felt personal. The co-star stared at the table, jaw clenched, trying not to laugh. Hopkins continued, voice steady, dignified, absolutely sincere. I have often found, he read, that the weight of destiny presses most heavily on those who prefer tea without sugar. A chair creaked. Someone coughed. The director frowned. Hopkins did not look up. He read on. And yet, he continued, in moments of great trial, I find myself wondering not about fate, but about whether anyone truly appreciates punctuality. The room was vibrating now. This wasn't a mistake. This was a slow-burning ambush. Hopkins turned the page. The co-star nearly lost it. The next line was worse. Hopkins read it flawlessly. With all due respect, he said in character, this entire operation feels less like a plan and more like an elaborate misunderstanding arranged by people who do not read instructions. The director's pen froze mid-note. A sound mixer slapped a hand over his mouth. Hopkins paused again, this time longer. He looked down at the page. Then, finally, he looked up. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Hopkins didn't look angry. He didn't look amused. He looked intrigued. He lowered the script slightly and scanned the faces around the table. No one met his eyes. Everyone subtly found the wood grain fascinating. He looked at the director. Is this new? Hopkins asked calmly. The director hesitated. I know. Hopkins nodded slowly. He looked at the co-star. The co-star stared back, face carefully neutral, eyes betraying everything. Hopkins smiled. Just a little. Ah, he said. The room exhaled, and then exploded. Laughter detonated from every corner. Someone fell back in their chair. A PA laughed so hard they slid down the wall. The director doubled over, script forgotten. Hopkins sat back, letting it wash over him. He didn't laugh immediately. He waited. When the laughter finally reached a manageable roar, Hopkins lifted the script and tapped it gently against the table. Well, he said, this is either a daring revision or a criminal act. The co-star finally broke. I couldn't resist. Hopkins tilted his head. You replaced my script. Yes, the co-star admitted. But you read it. Of course I did, Hopkins replied. It was in my hands. The director wiped his eyes. You didn't notice? Hopkins considered. I noticed something was curious. Then why keep going? The director asked. Hopkins smiled faintly. Because, he said, if someone has gone to the trouble of writing this much nonsense, the least I can do is honor their commitment. The laughter surged again. Hopkins flipped through the pages thoughtfully. You put effort into this, he said. Structure. Escalation. A third act payoff. The co-star nodded, proud. I stayed up all night. Hopkins looked impressed. That explains the cruelty. He closed the script gently and slid it back across the table. Well done, he said. But next time. The co-star leaned forward. Next time? Hopkins' eyes gleamed. You let me return the favor. The room went quiet again. Not with fear, with anticipation. Because everyone in that room knew one thing for certain. If Anthony Hopkins had accepted the prank, he was already planning something far worse. And far funnier. What no one knew yet, what would only reveal itself days later, was how precise his response would be. Not loud. Not obvious. Perfectly timed. The crew would lose it again. But not yet. Anthony Hopkins did not respond immediately. That was the first sign something was coming. The laughter eventually tapered off, leaving the room buzzing with leftover energy. Jokes were whispered. Someone mimed one of the absurd lines Hopkins had read with Shakespearean gravity. The co-star basked quietly in the glow of success, trying not to look too pleased with themselves. Hopkins simply gathered his things. He didn't lecture. He didn't warn. He didn't retaliate. He nodded once to the director, offered a polite, "Shall we take 5?" and left the room as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That unsettled people far more than anger would have. On the surface, the rest of the day returned to normal. Scenes were blocked. Notes were given. Hopkins delivered his work with the same precision he always had. If anything, he seemed lighter, amused, as if the prank had loosened something rather than irritated it. The co-star noticed. Oh, they muttered to themselves during lunch. Hopkins, meanwhile, was doing something far more dangerous than planning a prank. He was observing. He noticed how the co-star always skimmed scripts once they felt comfortable with a scene, how they trusted the rhythm of the room, how they relied on familiarity once confidence set in. Trust, the same opening Hopkins himself had offered without realizing it. 2 days later, they were scheduled for another table read. Smaller, more intimate. Just the principal cast, the director, and a handful of department heads. Hopkins arrived early again. So did the co-star. They exchanged pleasantries, cordial, professional, nothing unusual. Hopkins even complimented the co-star on a previous take. You have excellent instincts, Hopkins said. The co-star smiled, relieved. Coming from you, that means a lot. Hopkins nodded. It should. That should have been the second warning. When the scripts were distributed, everything looked normal. Same covers. Same markings. Same worn edges. The co-star flipped theirs open casually. Nothing jumped out. Hopkins sat quietly, hands folded, eyes down. The director clapped once. All right, let's start from scene 12. The co-star glanced at Hopkins, expecting him to go first. Hopkins didn't move. Oh, the director said, checking his notes. Actually, let's have you start this time. The co-star nodded and began reading. The first line was correct. The second line too. They relaxed. Hopkins listened, head slightly bowed, as if absorbed in the scene. The co-star continued. Then came the sentence. The one that shouldn't have been there. They read it aloud before their brain caught up. And in that moment, I realized I had underestimated not only the situation, but my own overconfidence. The co-star blinked. That line felt pointed. They glanced down. The next line was worse. I speak now not from wisdom, but from habit, hoping no one will notice the difference. A ripple moved through the room. Someone shifted in their chair. The director frowned. Is that? The co-star stopped. Wait, they said. Hopkins looked up. Yes, he asked innocently. The co-star flipped back a page. Then forward. The text was wrong. Not absurd like before. Sharper. More surgical. Every altered line cut closer. Not insulting, not humiliating, but uncomfortably accurate. Commentary disguised as dialogue. Observation hidden inside character. The co-star swallowed. Hopkins watched calmly. Would you like me to continue? He asked the director. The director hesitated, sensing something brewing. Let's pause. The room was silent. The co-star looked up at Hopkins. "You did this," they said quietly. Hopkins tilted his head. "Did I?" "You replaced my script," the co-star said. Hopkins smiled faintly. "I believe the word you used was return the favor." The room erupted. Not explosive laughter this time, but stunned disbelief followed by a slow, dawning realization of just how precise the reversal was. The director leaned back, hands on his head. "You didn't go for jokes." Hopkins nodded. "No, I went for timing." The co-star stared at the page again, then laughed, long, hard, helplessly. "This is brutal," they said. "You turned it into a character study." Hopkins shrugged. "You offered me a structure." The co-star looked up, genuine admiration now replacing mischief. "You could have embarrassed me," they said. "You didn't." Hopkins' voice softened. "Embarrassment peaks quickly. Insight lingers." The director shook his head in awe. "You weaponized restraint." Hopkins smiled. "I prefer to think of it as editing." The co-star closed the script and set it down. "All right," they said. "I surrender." Hopkins inclined his head. "Accepted." The room finally broke into full laughter, deeper this time, richer. Not just at the prank, but at the elegance of it. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. The set became something else. Lighter, yes, but also sharper. People paid closer attention. Not out of fear, but respect. The co-star, in particular, changed how they worked. They read more carefully, listened longer, trusted less in autopilot and more in presence. Hopkins noticed. He said nothing. That was his way. Years later, long after the film had wrapped and the stories had been polished into legend, the co-star would tell the tale in interviews. "Everyone talks about the first prank," they'd say. "The ridiculous one." But that wasn't the lesson. They'd pause. "The real lesson was the second script. The one that showed me myself. Without cruelty, without ego. Just accuracy." When asked what Hopkins said afterward, they'd smile. "Nothing memorable," they'd reply. That's the point. He didn't need the last word. Anthony Hopkins, for his part, never told the story unprompted. When it came up, he'd smile gently and say, "It's important to remember that humor doesn't have to be loud to be effective." Then he'd change the subject. Because for him, the prank had never been about winning. It was about reminding everyone in that room, himself included, of something essential. That mastery isn't fragile. That confidence can invite play. And that the sharpest wit isn't the one that humiliates, but the one that teaches without announcing itself. The crew remembered that. Long after the laughter faded, long after the scripts were shelved, they remembered the day Anthony Hopkins proved that even when the joke is on you, you can still control the timing. And when you do, everyone listens. In the weeks that followed, the ripple from that moment continued to move quietly through the production. No one talked about it directly anymore. The story had already solidified into legend, passed along in shorthand, the script swap, the reversal, Hopkins' timing. But the effect lingered in subtler ways. Table reads grew more attentive. Actors stopped skimming ahead, stopped assuming they knew where a scene was going simply because they'd lived with it for days. Scripts were held with more care. Pages turned more deliberately. Even the director noticed himself pausing longer before giving notes, letting a moment fully land before shaping it. The co-star, in particular, changed. They began arriving earlier, sitting quietly before rehearsals instead of joking through warm-ups. They listened when others spoke, truly listened, not waiting for a cue to jump back in. When a scene didn't work, they didn't push harder, they pulled back, adjusted, and tried again with restraint. Hopkins noticed all of this. He never commented on it. One afternoon near the end of the shoot, the co-star lingered after everyone else had cleared out. Hopkins was packing his bag slowly, unhurried. "You know," the co-star said, "that second script, it stung." Hopkins paused, then nodded. "It was meant to be felt. But not to wound," the co-star added. "Correct," Hopkins said. "Wounds make people defensive. Discomfort makes them curious." The co-star smiled. "You could have humiliated me." Hopkins looked up. "Why would I do that? You took a risk." "So did I." They stood in silence for a moment, the set empty around them. "I won't forget it," the co-star said finally. Hopkins smiled faintly. "Good. Then it did its job." Years later, when younger actors asked the co-star about working with Hopkins, they never led with the prank. They talked instead about discipline, about patience, about learning that true authority doesn't raise its voice.